Well, this is a pretty great conference, isn't it? I was really impressed with the extemporaneous speaking last night. So I asked a rogue clown to mess with my slide deck just to see what would happen. So we'll see what she did to me here. So I'm Ken Evans, and yes, I am a CISSP, and I know you're going to count that against me. I tried to call Eve Adams to get a Obey Ken license, but I couldn't get a hold of her last night, so I can't add it to my slide deck. And some other contact information. And as you know, today's defenders, us, we're being overwhelmed by circumstances in our environment. We've got all these different forces coming at us. We've got budget cuts. We've got consumerization of IT. And as a small company practitioner or a small company IT department, I start to ask myself the question, can we even do this? Can we even supply effective information security? So this is me. You can tell the resemblance by the bald spot on the top. And I'm in charge of an IT department, a registered investment advisory firm, an insurance group. Those are all code for regulations. And I've got a lot of decisions to make. My company's growing up. We're growing up from a startup. We're growing up into the kind of the middle enterprise area. And I know we need to have an effective security plan, but basically I'm looking around, I'm overwhelmed. I've got the shiny new device syndrome that everybody gets, even though I luckily made some good choices. You know, I've got Palo Alto, I've got FireEye, I've got some fair choices in there. But still I was looking for that silver bullet. I was looking for that one thing that's just going to come in there and fix everything for me and take care of everything. And then I found, oh, well, we need a framework. Okay. No problem. So I started doing some research on that, and I found this. NIST 853, holy crap. So I'm sitting on an airplane. It's 253 pages. I'm trying to digest. I'm coming back from San Francisco, long flight. And I hire an assistant named Jack. That didn't work out too well, as you can probably imagine. So here I am at the corner of lost and confused, right? I just need something simpler for my organization. It's a small business, for God's sake. I mean, NIST is great, but I'd like to go there someday. Can't go there right now. So I needed something understandable. Like I said, 253 pages, just not going to cut it for me. I need something achievable in my lifetime before I, pass away. I need something affordable. Some of these standards are excellent, but are very expensive to get started in or even get access to the information. ISO, need something real world and security based, not just compliance check mark based. PCI, I've got some allergies in here. I need something that's in line with other standards we might adopt later. My boss thinks he's doing business in Europe at some point in time, so that probably does mean ISO for me. So in short, I needed a miracle. So I stumbled on the critical security controls. And so what exactly are these controls? So they are a set of technical controls selected and prioritized by consensus agreement. And let me back up for 1 second. They are technical controls. They are not physical, and they are not process controls. They are, again, prioritized by consensus agreement by government agencies, many large companies, and several large forensic firms, which I am promised everyone will know the name of, but no one will actually admit it because they don't want it to be a target. But I speculate on some of the names that are in there, and they're some of the big ones. So what are some of the benefits of a consensus of this group? It's hard to get a consensus out of, a couple hundred people for anything. So as a smaller company, it supplies me with valuable security intelligence. I don't have time to be watching everything that's going on, but I'm effectively multiplied by the effect of all of these organizations that do have a lot more resources than I do. It keeps my programs current as the controls are looked at and revised year after year. And it lets me know what my peers are doing. It lets me know what they think is important. So it helps keep me on track and minimizes the amount of energy that I have to spend worrying about and prioritizing certain things. So some additional benefits are As I mentioned, it's a solid platform to build other standards on, like NIST or ISO, or even PCI. It can be used as a roadmap, and it can be a starting point for those who are under assault and just don't know even where to begin. So this is the CSC BOK, or Body of Knowledge. It just sounds so much more formal that way. It's largely contained in a 90-page PDF, which includes pictures, so I mean, it's less than 90 pages of reading, really. And it's also encapsulated in the poster. Now, I'm going to refer to this poster a couple times, but I stole about 200 of them from SANS. I have them at the edge of the room. They're very cool if you are interested in this project, so pick one up on your way out. So some of the core principles of the security controls are, first, that the offense informs the defense. So we want to focus on actual attacks, not theoreticals. We're going to come back to each one of these in more detail. Automation, attackers are using it. We need to do it too. Metrics, we have to measure what we're doing to make sure it's even effective. And there it goes, continuous monitoring. Are the controls really still in place, and are they really functioning? So let's talk about offense informs defense. We have all of this stuff. We have years of experience, policies and frameworks, firewalls, antivirus, IPS, vulnerability scans, pen tests, et cetera, and we are still being owned. So why is this? Well, it could be that we're sometimes focused on just doing things instead of doing the right things, or doing good things versus the right things. So let's look at that a little bit further. So what is effective security? I borrowed this slide from Dr. Cole at SANS, and you've probably all seen this formula before. Threats times vulnerabilities equals risk. Now, you all know in multiplication, if you bring either of these on the left side of the equation to 0, your product of the equation is 0. In other words, your risk will be 0. If you can eliminate all threats, you can eliminate all vulnerabilities, you'll get 0 risk. But we really don't control threats. Threats are from the outside. Vulnerabilities are the only thing that we can control. So we tend to focus on that part of the equation while ignoring the threats. Well, while vulnerabilities, like I mentioned, do reduce risk, it's really should be the threats that drive the risk calculation. In other words, if threat for a particular vulnerability is 0, this equation is already at 0, right? So we want to find real threats, not theoreticals or long shot threats. Two more words to associate with this. Our threats equal offense, and our defense centers around fixing vulnerabilities. So there's your offense informs defense. So we really need to prioritize our threats, because otherwise we'll just be running around doing the wrong thing. Let's compare two. So take penetration testing versus application whitelisting. So penetration testing, very sexy topic. As Steve was just pointing out, it's the thing everybody loves to do. Versus application whitelisting, it's a big topic right now, kind of difficult, sometimes expensive to implement. Well, on the scale of the critical controls, this is rated as critical security control 20, so that's the lowest level of priority. And application whitelisting is rated as 2. Well, why is that? It's likely that if you are penetrated by or if you're breached during a pen test, they're basically going to start to install some toolkits, look around. They're going to start to execute some code that doesn't belong in your environment as part of their process of moving around your system. Well, if you have application whitelisting installed, you're going to basically stop them from executing code that you don't want running in your environment, that you have not approved. Let's take another one. Data loss prevention versus continuous vulnerability assessment and remediation. So DLP, another big sexy product that you can be sold at conferences like RSA. Continuous vulnerability assessment, and that's generally product-based too. But unless you really have an insider threat, if your DLP program is about data being exfiltrated out of your environment, this is rated as critical security control 17, pretty high. This is rated as number 4. Well, why is that? It's because it's likely that a vulnerability is going to be exploited in the process of exfiltrating your data. So why not just start with the core thing, fixing the vulnerability that gave them access to the data and the ability to exfiltrate it in the first place? So coming back around, we do a lot, and reducing vulnerabilities is good, but fixing the right vulnerabilities is really critical to our organization, primarily because we all have limited time and resources and money. So prioritization really is an absolute requirement. Let's talk a minute about automation. If this represents your manual process, this would represent your automated process. Got a nice little engine on the back there. So the bad guys are using automated tools. We should too, right? Doesn't matter how bright you are, and there are a lot of bright people here, but automation is always going to win. Imagine a race between these two things. We don't have enough trained defenders to support manual processes, and manual just does not scale. And that's probably all I need to say in this room about that topic. There is a caveat emptor with regards to automation and the critical security controls. Some controls do have a manual validation component. It's kind of hard to, for example, validate your backups with software. I've seen one company that's trying to get there. But in essence, obviously, to validate your backup, you're rebuilding an environment, you're restoring it, you're making sure everything there's a lot involved. Security skills gap assessment, number 9 is a manual. Pen testing is obviously half art and half science, so you can't replace the art part. Incident response, critical control number 18. And secure network engineering, another one. So some of your processes may also have manual components when you're getting started until you can actually improve them. So let's talk for a minute about metrics. It's really critical to measure and audit what you're doing, and you basically need to approve that you're focused properly and that your expenditures are effective. That's the best way to get more money out of management, frankly. So what kind of metrics do we want? Well, we want metrics that the security group can define, that IT can actually implement, something that they've defined, that auditors can measure, and that management can understand. When you get all of that in sync, I call it the circle of love.
There's only one girl there.
Okay, well, thank you for that observation. Let's talk about continuous monitoring. We need to carry out continuous monitoring, auditing, and testing. We need to test that the controls that we've put in place are actually working. Not a critical security control, but a related story. We recently, the electricians in our building needed to work on the power, and they asked us if they could drop the power in the building. They said, we can do it hot, but we'd prefer, if we could drop the power. And so, okay. We made the brave decision to throw the mains and go on battery, right? It's been a long time since we've done it, kind of nervous about it. Through the mains, on battery, everything's great, no problem, except my pager's not going off. So we accidentally discovered, and we ended the test and put back online. We accidentally just totally tripped on the fact that somewhere our notification system had been changed or broken down. So that's an example of continuous monitoring. You've got a control in place, but how do you know it's working 6 months later? It could have been broken or changed anywhere in that chain. So it's important to do that, and also to validate the effectiveness of the controls you've put in place. So a lot of people, when they say continuous monitoring, this is what they think. I got enough going on already. But the truth is, remember that automation thing? This can be you after continuous monitoring. Right? Check it from the beach. So I've talked a lot about the critical security controls, but let's just walk through the list real quick. So introducing the critical security controls. So I broke them down into large text, so we're going to have a couple screens of them. And they are primarily, you'll notice this column for the NSA mitigation attack mitigation assessment score. That is the primary thing that controls the ranking. Remember that threat, it's driven by threat. So we start with our very highs. We have inventory of unauthorized and unauthorized devices, inventory of authorized and unauthorized software, software configurations for hardware, software, laptops, workstations, continuous vulnerability assessment and remediation, and number 5, malware defenses. Continuing on, we have application software security, wireless device control, data recovery capability, security skills assessment, and appropriate training to fill the gaps. That's an interesting one to tell management about. Secure configurations for network devices such as firewalls, limitation and control of network ports, protocols, and services, controlled use of administrative privileges. How many XP boxes were still running out there as admin? Boundary defense, maintenance, monitoring, and analysis, and that should have been continuous maintenance, monitoring, analysis of security audit logs, controlled access based on need to know, account monitoring and control, data loss prevention, incident response management, secure network engineering, and penetration tests and red team exercises. So those are our 20. Here's an interesting way to look at it. It's going to be something like this on the poster. I break it down slightly differently. But here's what the NSA will say that are the actions that adversaries take during an attack to get into your systems. So they start with reconnaissance, then they get into your system, then they take steps to stay in your system, and then they execute the exploit. The critical controls actually stack like this. We've got a couple that work in the reconnaissance bin, we've got a couple that work in the get-in phase, a couple that impact the stay-in phase, and a couple that stack up in the exploitation phase. So it's an interesting way to consider the controls in addition to just the straight-up ordered list. And again, that's going to be on the poster. Here is another interesting way to look real quick at the critical security controls. For the first time, the Verizon threat report for 2013 has included a section on the critical controls and the threats as they classify them on this side here on the left. And then they've built a grid that say which of the critical controls affect these particular threats that we have found. So that's a new piece of information. So I've been trying to bait you in. There's only 20 critical controls. How hard can it be? Right? Well, I lied. There are actually 198 subcontrols. Each control has 4 to 17 subcontrols. However, this is actually good news because unlike PCI, which just says you must have a firewall between untrusted zones of your network, and they're done, the subcontrols actually literally define and tell you what you should be doing for each of the controls. So it is actually more guidance. It's actually more useful than some of the vaguer standards that don't commit, sort of like FINRA and SEC. So how are the subcontrols categorized? So we start with quick wins. This is sort of your Pareto principle, 80-20. You can do this fast. It generally doesn't cost as much. And it impacts a lot it constitutes a lot of your defenses. Then we have improved visibility and attribution, which is just more monitoring and more information about your environment. We have hardened configurations and improved hygiene. And then we have advanced controls, and these are basically going to be your more expensive high-end tools to really prevent the most determined attackers. So what were those categories again? Well, let me illustrate it like this. Say you've been put in charge of protecting a critical government installation. So what might your first step be? Well, the first thing you might do is just throw up a fence, right? This is your quick win. This is going to stop the majority of the people that are trying to get into the area that you're going to protect. So after that, you might add some visibility and attribution, some lights and cameras so you can monitor your control and its effectiveness and see how many people are approaching the fence and are turned away. Then you might need to maintain and configure the control properly. So we added an access road here so we can drive along and look for holes in the fences and fix those, or make sure the contractors installed it properly or whatever. And then finally you have your advanced control, which is represented here by a second fence and some razor wire. Now notice in the analogy the complexity of the advanced control versus the quick win. They're both fences, but the advanced control has got a lot more going on here, a lot more complex, probably a lot more expensive. It's really there to stop the most determined attackers. So let's do a deep dive through critical security control number 1, which is inventory of authorized and unauthorized devices. And we're going to look at how the controls are structured in the documents and how each control is applied. So each control is going to have an overview section. In this case, basically states the processes and tools used to track, control, and prevent network access, basically with anything that has an IP address, is what the control's after monitoring. So the first section, after the overview, we have a processes and tools for implementation discussion, and it says in English what you're needing to accomplish. You want to do an active scan for network assets. You want to record IP and MAC addresses. You want to determine the owner of the asset once you find it. You want to create an asset database. You want to implement 802.1x and NAC. You want to scan for ports, services, and other things to fingerprint machines. And finally, you want to implement passive scanning for devices that you're not expecting on there. So let's break that down. Again, let's look at, there's 3 quick wins listed in critical control number 1. And remember, the fence is our quick win analogy, the 80-20 thing that's not expensive to get in place and prevents a lot. So the quick wins for critical control number 1 are to create an asset inventory from both passive and active scans and put that into an asset database. Feed your DHCP logs into the asset database, and make sure that new equipment adds itself into the asset database. Caveat, you can also use a change control process here if you wish to. Now, stop real quick and compare this versus some other standards that you've seen. This is pretty straightforward set of steps that they're saying that you should be taking. Visibility and attribution, remember that those were our lights and cameras that were watching the fence. We have one in this for critical control 1. Improve the asset inventory database by adding additional information like the owner, the name, what the system does, what its criticality is, basically flesh out that asset database so that during an incident or something like that, you have all that information at hand. Then we have our configuration and hygiene controls, and again, those were about making sure the controls are properly configured and those types of things. So we have 5 of those. Protect and secure that asset database that you built. Map critical data that's in your system to which hardware pieces it actually lives on. Deploy 802.1x using the asset database. Deploy NAC to isolate deploy NAC and isolate unauthorized systems. And use separate VLANs for BYOD and untrusted systems. And finally, our advanced control, which we have 1 of. Use client certificates to identify first and then authenticate prior to private network connection. So that is actually, for those of you that play in this space, is actually, that in combination with NAC is about as high as you can get. So what are the metrics for this particular control? Why are we doing this and what are we going to measure? Well, we want to identify new unauthorized devices connected to the network within 24 hours. We want to make sure an alert has gone out to the fact that a device has been connected, and that alert should be repeated until the alert is resolved. We want to isolate that device from the network within 1 hour of detection, we also want to notify that the isolation is accomplished. How do we test that? Well, we go in and periodically connect 10 devices to the network. We want to spread it across different network segments if you have them. You want some in the DMZ, you want some out at the data center, you want some back at the office. And 2 of these devices should have never been seen by your asset database. So you've got 0 knowledge about at least 2 devices. So you want to verify that they were noticed and that you got the, hey, this device is connected email within 24 hours. And you want to verify that it was isolated into a VLAN within an hour. Now, those are just starting metrics, by the way. The documentation will come right out and say 24 hours, in our opinion, is kind of loose. You want to make that closer to an hour, but this is a starting point to just get the program in place. You also want to verify that you received the isolation notification email within an hour. So this is analogous to, hey, my pager didn't go off. Okay, you put this control in place. You actually got to test it to make sure you're literally getting these emails. So how do we get started if this is interesting you and you want to look at implementing this in your environment? So first you need to familiarize yourself with the controls, and there's 2 primary methods of doing that. One is to read them, and they're hosted currently at sans.org, or take a class is another method. Or I've just recently stood up a website called cschub.com, and I'm basically just trying to collect all things that have to do with the critical security controls there in kind of a community, public domain environment. When you're looking at the controls, start to look for overlaps based on your environment, and we'll go over that more in a second, and think of tools and processes that you already have in place that you can leverage. A lot of these things you may have some things going already in these categories. So let's talk about the overlaps. For example, that asset inventory database from control number 1, the inventory of hardware assets, that same database can possibly be used for inventory of software assets. So there's an overlap there. Another overlap is network access control. The inventory from critical control 1 can also be used in critical control 7 for wireless device control, because if you've got a limited number of wireless access devices you want attached to your environment, when a new one shows up, you need to know it and maybe block it, and that's part of critical control 7, the wireless access or wireless device control. Here is an extreme example, in my opinion, of NAC, according to Tripwire. I personally am not sure I agree with this, but this is an example, and you don't need to read everything, just kind of eyeball it. This is an example of how many overlaps across the multiple controls you may be able to find in your environment. So how do you implement this stuff? Well, of course, the answer is always it depends. It depends on your environment. But here are a couple common paths for implementation. First, most pressing. If you're being owned, if you know you're vulnerable in a spot, just go there. Pick out whichever controls deal with that particular spot and just fix the real problem. Gap analysis is another method. This is useful if you've got some controls already in place and you want to know you want to decide how far they are from where they should be versus where they are. Some additional methods are go from the quick wins to the advanced, and this is most useful to get a lot of stuff in place quickly. Maybe most useful for small environments, small business environments, where there's not a lot of budget, but they want to get started with InfoSec. Just start sweeping through all the quick wins and work your way up the stack. And then tool influence. You may have tools that you own that already deal with a lot of these things, so that's another good place to start too, since you've already spent the money. Speaking of that, that's if you happen to see the article about the Colorado CISO that revamped the whole state InfoSec program for a mere $6,000, that's what he did. He decided to bring in the critical security controls, and first step he did, he inventoried his environment, and he said, we already own a bunch of this stuff. We're not properly utilizing it, so he stopped all new acquisitions, and basically made better use of what he had to implement the critical security controls. And finally, on the poster, you're going to see a new Getting Started Part 1 and 2 section. So let's review those real quick. So they point out that controls 2 through 4 have 5 quick wins that have a huge payoff. For anybody who might be familiar with the Australian 35 that came out about 2 years ago, and they said these 4 things prevent 80% of attacks, in our opinion. This is kind of an analogous to that. So application whitelisting, huge one, but kind of expensive sometimes. Use common secure configurations. Patch application software within 48 hours. Patch system software within 48 hours. And reduce the number of users with administrative privileges. Now, you may be doing a couple of these, especially those patching ones, but one of the things is, are you measuring it? Can you prove it to yourself? Can you prove it to someone else that you're actually doing it? Are you doing all of your systems? My favorite one to not patch is Oracle, because oh my God, what a pain in the butt to take a night or a weekend to take the whole system down. And with Oracle, things go wrong. When you try and bring it back up, suddenly it's not working. So that's my favorite one to leave lagging. Well, if there's a measurement system, I get called out on that, right? The other sysadmins know that, yeah, Ken's not doing his job again. So again, that's on the poster. Then part 2 is start asking and answering key questions. What are you, in fact, trying to protect? This is sort of like a data-centric approach, sort of like Steve was talking about. He called it a vector-based approach. But what are you effectively trying to protect? What devices and data? So what are your gaps on the protections for that particular set of things you're trying to protect? And then what are your priorities amongst that group? And then where can you automate? What tools do you already own that can just jump in there and help you? Also, what tools from vendors might help a lot? So again, that's outlined on the poster. So I'm a small business environment, and it actually makes me unhappy every time I want to go do anything and I need $50,000, right? It's just not going to happen all the time. Not to mention, it's the shiny toy syndrome. It doesn't exactly fix all the problems. It's basically often vendors selling you hype. So I'm very keen on what you can do in your environment with what you've already got. So some controls can be implemented with what you have. Well, you've got AV already, right? So can you get it to report malware to you within a certain time period? Can you get it to quarantine the email to you in a certain time period? And then can you validate it that it's actually happening? Probably. And that's control number 5. Control number 1, you can run Nmap against your devices. You can diff the results every single day or every hour, depending on how aggressive you want to be. And you can email yourself the changes. In other words, you can build a baseline and keep comparing against the baseline. How expensive is that? Of course, don't try that on IPv6. I get you, but Americans don't implement IPv6. The problem is it takes about a decade to scan a network range with Nmap rather. And also, whitelisting. There is a poor man's way to do whitelisting, and NSA published it like 2 years ago, and it's based on Windows SRP, stuff that we all already own and probably are not touching. So it's based on SRP and a couple procedures, and you can have application whitelisting for not spending a dime. Another project that I was very excited to learn about is the POSHSec project. You guys may have heard about it in some of the other talks. Yeah, I'm a POSHSec groupie. How many people have a POSHSec phone? Nobody? I do. So you can see here that POSHSec is currently handling something on many of the security controls, but they're planning, if they keep to their schedule by Grand Rapids, GERCON, having something in place for 14 of the 20 critical security controls. Don't have to spend a dime. You can get many of the controls underway with the POSHSec code. How cool is that? So there's some more sources that are available. I mentioned the cschhub.com site. It literally finally got stood up at 4:30 in the morning. My vendor apparently didn't know how to make a DNS record, and I had to keep calling and haranguing them. So it looks like a 2-year-old designed it right now. Don't hold it against me. I was just trying to get it in place. The forums are not out there right now, but a lot of links to case studies and other resources are out there. But basically, with your help, with anybody who's interested in this topic and implementing it in their environment, I want to build a premier community resource and a community center to have a discussion about the critical security controls and how they can be implemented. Also, I mentioned POSHSEC. I'll throw that up again. And I also have some contact information for myself at the CSC Hub class. I am also a SANS mentor. In October, I'm actually teaching the critical security controls class in the SANS mentor format. Now, this is going to be a very cool class for one reason. That's because we're going to take the critical controls across 10 weeks and meet one night a week and discuss 1 to 3 of the controls. And there's going to be 10 or 12 of us sitting in a room, and we're actually going to have the opportunity to discuss what we found in our environments when we studied a control, and then we went back and looked at our environment. So what challenges did you find? It's going to be 50% learning, 50% consulting when it really comes down to it, because you're going to have access to your peers and how they're handling the same control in their environment. And I was surprised to learn this. There is actually an amazing 15% discount on that course, in addition to the early bird pricing. Gets that price of that course down to about $2,600. Anybody that's taken a SANS course before knows that is a great steal. There's a brochure next to the poster that has more information on the link to this course if you're interested. So, I went pretty fast, so I have time for questions if anybody has any. Go ahead.
So implementing some of the controls, especially the top 5 or so in your own environment, what did you get as quick wins?
Well, I'm a little bit unique in that my FTE, or full-time equivalent dedicated to security, is about 0.75 people.
Okay.
So we got through a gap analysis. We identified where we wanted to focus, and we are trying to start at the beginning and implement critical control number 1. That doesn't mean we don't have a lot of things in place, but that means we're trying to actually get the proper metrics feedback from control number 1. This is where we decided to start. This is really, depending on your environment, it's a multi-month or a multi-year project. For us, it's a 3 to 5 year endeavor just because of the small size of our environment. But we need to start somewhere. So, I think you had a question, or?
Do you find that implementing these controls will cover most of the regulatory agency requirements, like NCA?
I've heard, and I'm not an expert in any of those, so I can only tell you what I've heard. I've heard PCI, no problem. Actually, you'll find in some of the resources mappings to NIST, to PCI, a couple. I'm not sure about HIPAA or some of the others. Did you have a comment on that or another? Okay, I'll get to you in a second. Sorry. But yes, because as you all know, when you become compliant, you don't necessarily become secure, but when you become secure, you almost certainly are compliant. And that same effect is involved here. So, go ahead.
So I kind of had two things. One was you mentioned the fact that you had the power issue and your pager didn't go off.
Yeah.
As a systems administrator, we have tons of monitoring software in place at our location. And we've had situations where even recently alerts haven't gone off. It's like, why? That alert has been working for years. Why does it not work now? What happened? So, and going back and finding out that somebody made a change in the code, that those are big things. It's very hard to find those sometimes. But you kind of commented when he asked you the question. So I was going to ask you, with regard to how you started your process, did you decide to go, okay, we're just going to worry about CSC 1, then go CSC 2, or did you go for the quick wins, really quick to try and get at least as much as you could get taken care of across the whole domain?
In our environment, what will probably end up happening is we will probably sweep the quick wins first. We have a bunch of things in place. I name dropped FireEye and Palo Alto, so Some of those things are the only thing that has saved me from serious compromise so far. So we just recently implemented Alien Vault, which has the OSEC, which you talked about. So we've got a lot of stuff laying around. We're probably going to end up sweeping the quick wins and actually putting those tools that we already own into use and getting official metrics and monitoring out of them. So in our case, in a lot of areas, the thing that we need to add is the monitoring and testing components. A lot of the controls were already in place. So.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, we use the 20 controls in a Fortune 500 environment as our framework, and we went with visibility first. So our
Interesting.
goal was, I want to know what's going on in this place first, and then we kind of went down the path of some more preventative controls just for feedback. The other thing to share with folks that worked really well for us is we do a circle bubble chart of the 20 controls, and we color code them red, yellow, green based upon our assessment, and we share that with leadership. So they don't have to know a stinking thing about security or technology, but they can see that visually as we move from year to year and how those colors change. It's been really effective for us. Our senior leadership actually understands when somebody says 20 controls what we're talking about.
That's kind of cool. If you have one you could sanitize, you wouldn't mind me posting on the site.
I'm going to send you a bunch of stuff to put up on CSE Hub, absolutely.
That'd be great.
Yep.
Yeah, I dovetail off of what he said in initiating the visibility first, because then you have a picture that you can present to the business managers and help qualify to them what the exposures are and where the priorities are. So it's a very good tool for being able to getting corporate buy-in.
That probably makes sense in a lot of environments. I can tell you, like, the State Department took a totally different tack. They were the first ones to kind of prove the effectiveness of these controls, and they decided, it was number 10, I think, and it might have changed numbers between the two versions. So you're going to have to let me go with, they picked one control that was their, I believe it's outlined on the poster, that was their major problem across all of their embassies across the world, and they implemented that one control, and it reduced 85% of their problems, and they basically graphed it, and all that's explained on the chart also. So yeah, there's a bunch of different ways to handle it. It's whatever makes sense for your environment. Anybody else? I'm standing between you and lunch, but go ahead.
Is your slide deck going to be up on CSC Hub?
Yes, also, if I'm not mistaken, this YouTube is going to be available. Once I get the, I don't know if I'll put the slide deck on. I might put the, I could, but certainly the link to the YouTube will be out there too. Okay. Well, great. It's, oh, go ahead.
You mentioned the fact that you tried to read NIST 853. That's only one of the documents.
Yes, I know.
There's a lot more. So,
I know.
yeah, when you're in administration, you're going, okay, so this is, what does NIST recommend? You go, okay, you have the whole 800 series. Yeah, if you try and do all of it, you do all of it, you might as well figure you're giving up a month of your life.
Yeah, same with
And
ISO.
you're not going to understand it all.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I communicated it, but I am really very excited about the fact that this is doable for my organization. This is achievable, like I said, in my lifetime, before I die. So, great. All right, well, great. Thanks, guys.